Welcome everybody here tonight at Bergen Kunsthal to a platform talk by Sara Yazdani titled Ice, Video Sensibility and the Weather. The talk is part of the exhibition program for our current exhibition at Bergen Kunsthal titled The Ocean. And it's part of an extensive events program that investigates several of the aspects that play a role in the exhibition. And what is great and special about the talk tonight is that it does not look specifically into a topical aspect and a theme of the exhibition, but really looks also into the way that artists deal with such topics that play a role in the exhibition. And it's something that is important for the exhibition as a whole. I think some of the topics that play a role in the exhibition, such as climate change, weather, ecological concerns about the ocean are really important, and many of the works in the exhibition show us that artists actually think of not only what to say but also how to say it, how to investigate such a topic, how to make a picture, and how to make such a picture actually critical. So in her talk, Sara Yazdani will focus specifically on one artist which is presented in the exhibition, Susan Schuppli, present here with a large installation in our Gallery 5, a 3-channel video work, or a space with 3 videos. And based on these works, she will develop further thoughts on what is at stake for environmental concerns and scientific inquiry when video and sound technologies produce not only representations of the world, but processes and parallel ecologies that complicate prevailing ideas of sensation, knowledge and mediation of ice and the ocean. And to introduce our speaker tonight, Sara Yazdani is an associate professor of art history and art theory at the Department of Art and Craft at the Oslo National Academy of the Arts. And she's also a research associate in the Excellence Cluster Matters of Activity at Humboldt University in Berlin. And she has published quite frequently and widely, but she's currently also working on a first monograph on the work of Wolfgang Tillmans and the re-emergence of an ecological processual approach to visual art. And the book has the working title Self-Sufficiency, Art, Technologies and Other Ecologies. I have a few practical remarks also to make. The first one is that we also have a talk tomorrow for those who watch online or want to come back. A film screening, Serpent Rain, which will be screened. It's a 30-minute film, and there will be afterwards a conversation with Arjuna Neumann, Denise Ferreira de Silva, the 2 filmmakers, and the group WUMA, who is also involved in the exhibition here. And then a few more practical remarks. First of all, thanks to the technical team, to everybody working at Kunsthal, to making this evening happening. And then this event is, as most of our platform talks, live streamed. There are 2 cameras in the space. Please make sure you're not looking into the camera if you don't want to be filmed. And then also we have first a talk, approximately 50 minutes long, with the possibility afterwards to ask questions. And if you ask questions, which is very welcome, please use a microphone, because otherwise the online audience can't hear you. So, with these words, thank you especially, Sara, for coming to us here to Bergen again. It's great to have you, and we're really curious about your talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Let's see. Okay, so slide should be up, I hope. Okay, while that is setting up then, there you go, perfect, thanks. Thank you for that really kind introduction. Axel, it's really nice to be back in Bergen, and it's also really nice to participate in this Ocean Platform program that you've set up in extension or in dialogue with the exhibition. So thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. It's really nice to to see some people here today on this rainy Bergen evening, not at least to be able to speak physically in this actual auditorium or gallery. Very much appreciated. And also, thank you for all of you out there tuning in online. It's nice to have these hybrid solutions. So as Axel briefly kind of like mentioned or digged into, in this talk this evening, I will discuss the various types of environments and sensations found or to be explored in the works of Susan Schuppli. I would say the later works of Susan Schuppli. And we will also go back a little bit in time. Some which are included in this extensive exhibition on the ocean here in Bergen Kunsthal. So in Schuppli's recent works, video and sound technologies create visual effects. And dynamic operations, they seem to be related, seem to be at least, to technical, natural and material realities, and kind of more than human capacities to sense, see and partake in environments in ways that provoke, I would say, a different scenario and mode of vision of ice and the ocean. And certainly also the changing weather condition of the Arctic. So as we will see soon, there are these dynamic transformations taking place in her work, very much of importance as they underscore that we are no longer seeing the world through the human eye, but through, or perhaps with, or an extension of the machine, which is in dialogue with the conditions of the weather and the ice in these particular video works. So today, this evening, I want to point to how art and research, I would say, or kind of artistic research projects, allows us to discuss what is at stake for environmental thoughts and scientific inquiry when video and sound technologies produce not representations of the world, but processes, or what could be defined as parallel ecologies, between different modes of being and sensing. So to go a little bit deeper into her work then, and to kind of like see how all this began, let's go back a little bit in time to the late 2010s and early 2020s. And I want to do this by starting to tell a little story about exactly what happened. So in August 2020, the artist and researcher Susan Schuppli arrived in Longyearbyen, a small coal mining town at the Nordensjøland Peninsula of Svalbard, the largest island of the Svalbard Arctic archipelago. Here, a small sailboat was waiting, ready to set off with Schuppli, her research assistant and cinematographer, glaciologist Miriam Jackson, and a selection of recording technologies she had packed, including a thermography camera, a hydrophone, and a geophone. And they all set off for a research expedition in the Barents Sea. The ambition of the journey, part of Schuppli's larger research project, Learning from Ice, was to do fieldwork, primarily documenting the materiality, formation, and life worlds of the glaciers within the surrounding Arctic landscape. This was not an ordinary Arctic expedition, however. The budget was low, more or less self-funded, meaning that the sailboat Valiente was small, and the crew, including mandatory guides due to the polar bear threats, sailors, and other adventures, was very minimal. So the artist, who had spent the last years exploring ice, technologies, and other non-human forces and objects as witnesses, what she refers to as material witnesses in her recent work, now felt the need to create self-reflective footage of the Barents Sea. The idea was, it seems, that cinematic technologies in their various forms would make it possible to aggregate an alternative knowledge of nature, to render the eternal life of ice, as Susan herself has written, in new ways. The small budget 2020 journey, as it turned out, led into 11 nights and 11 days of intense work, where learning from ice became a matter of cooking, surveilling icebergs, working shifts, maneuvering through bad weather, keeping warm, taking notes, cleaning the sailboat, shooting film, and recording sounds above and beneath the water surface. And all this was done in between trying to get some sleep. What was perhaps not so predicted was the way in which video technologies too went on and off, almost as they also were taking shifts, striving to adjust to the cold weather and trying to maintain focus in the extreme ocean swell. The latitude of the Svalbard Arctic archipelago is around 79 degrees, and during the trip in August, the temperature dropped below 25 minus degrees Celsius, certainly putting operational challenges to the crew, but also to the machines themselves, these recording technologies. So the association between the human and the technical subject, adjusting, sleeping, sensing, and kind of behaving in accordance with the cold weather and moving ocean, seems to have become a part of the premise of the formalization and conceptualization of the footage of this particular journey. Probing its close relation to ice and sunlight, video technology, again, I would say, presented itself as a technology of sleep and life, a sensibility, as I will discuss here today, that complicates prevailing ideas and mediations of planet Earth, in this case, particularly the ocean and the ice. So shall we have a little look into then on not planet Earth, or how to denaturalize the image from 2021, which is the first video that emerged out of the footage from this particular journey. So it's a video work consisting of images from the journey divided into film sequences, presenting different technical and material modes of Arctic filming.
Our equipment is challenged by these blue extremes. Yet taking the aesthetic regime of climate change seriously involves the recognition that the conditions of image production are themselves deeply entangled with the environmental conditions they seek to document.
Our equipment is challenged, Susan Schuppli underlines. And the conditions of image production are themselves deeply entangled with the environmental conditions they seek to document, and the history of image extraction that have long colonized our Western imagination. So the voice heard is Susan Schuppli's, sharing her field notes and reflecting on the conditions of ice she had researched over the years. So image technologies, in her view, as I read this, are inherently in the world, formatting and responding in accordance with their environments. So in order to understand contemporary images about climate change, one also needs to recognize the images have shaped the many histories of the Arctic, especially through Western imaginations, expeditionary imaginations. So Schuppli's insistence on a kind of like a storytelling here in Not Planet Earth in the form of what may be understood as kind of like alternative scientific notes or pseudo-scientific notes and image making were rooted in a view of the Arctic and science inquiries in ecological terms, in which the environment is produced by a plural of life forms and strange, highly important entanglements. So my question today then is whether Not Planet Earth tells an alternative or different story of the polar region. The first sentence states the political ambition behind their work as we view this environment. I just quoted the voiceover here. The Svalbard Arctic archipelago is an environment saturated with politics. But little, if anything, of these politics is readily perceptible within the visual fields. So saturations seemingly have two meanings here. The production of saturated images depicting the environment as untouched, natural and beautiful, as we often see in kind of Anthropocene images in the classic sense. And it also means that politics invisibly is saturated in the land and the environment, layer by layer. So after all then, Learning from Ice is a research project guided by the multiple aims of exploring the different knowledge practices mediated by ice, as well as the politics of cold within cryospheric environments in the Canadian Arctic, Svalbard Archipelago, the Hindu Kush Himalayas, as well as within anthropogenic contexts such as icebox detention at the US-Mexico border. That's Susan herself explaining this work. So through research and close engagements with the technologies of video and also sound, it's an artistic research project that investigates frozen landscapes as a vast information network composed of material as well as social, cultural sensors. So it seems then as Planet Earth and this series of work in the same kind of like vein, or like the recent works of Susan, may function as models or kind of like tests of such sensors. So let's go back a little bit into the material then. The first image of Not Planet Earth is completely black. Nature is something we hear along with blackness. And occasionally we hear the sound of the boat and beeping submarines that fades into calm ocean's waves of Svalbard.
The Svalbard Arctic archipelago is an environment saturated with politics. But little, if anything, of these politics is readily perceptible within the visual field. Telecommunications and military intelligence gathering traverse the electromagnetic spectrum of the atmosphere. Nuclear submarines operate in stealth mode beneath the sea ice. Competing sovereignties and contested access to resources have shaped its history. In response, I experienced...
Can you stop there? So the first image kind of appears almost as a typical natural documentation of nature in which humans are kind of using cameras to record or observe or even surveil the world out there. yet it's slightly cooler, almost dreamy. But suddenly the ice, water, and sky dramatically transform into a bright yellow, pink, red, and orange landscape of glitches that move in accordance with the movement of the ocean. The sun becomes more and more intensified, hot, and it kind of all turns into a red computational world. A few seconds later, we can see an image of the ice block and water again. Now looking cooler, softer, light, and it's this one here. Kind of like this light blue, purple with a bright turquoise and pink details of the ice carve. So these transformations are important as they underscore that we are no longer seeing the world through the human eye, but through with the machine, which is in dialogue with the conditions of the weather in this ice landscape. So these transformations, as I call them, from hot to cold, or from cold to hot, and then back to cold but warm, and the disappearing of the visual landscape, which is kind of like transformed. We can stop there. Which is kind of like it transformed almost into something abstract or kind of abstraction. Present, I would say, a rather techno-natural world perspective of a lived environment beyond our traditional aesthetics, taking technicalities of the digital video recorder and the life of the ice into critical account. We are now, I would say, entering a different model of perceiving and mediating. As Susan also mentions in this clip, if we would have hold on to a few seconds, in the shooting of Not Planet Earth, or How to Denaturalize the Image, Schuppli experimented with various recording technologies, including a FLIR thermal camera, which is a digital system that creates images using infrared radiation, IR, instead of the more common visible light spectrum, which we're used to in normal cameras. So what this means is that the bright red and orange colors, as we see, and shapes of the hot looking, almost burning landscape, are created when the devices senses the energy of heat in its surrounding. A form of sensing that is definitely not human. For Schuppli herself, using the thermal camera was a significant decision. Thermostatic conditions are extremely difficult to represent through a visual medium, meaning the weather, whatever that may be, is difficult to transform into like an aesthetic object or a visual object. So these images produced by this particular camera trigger, I would say, a dramatic and political aesthetic effect of the invisible yet forceful heat. The abstract ice, water, and sky formation seen in the red sequence are coded as hot, vibrant, and the movement of the ocean, wind, and ice are given new visibilities. So I would say that this type of aesthetics is produced in a dynamic dialogue between the device and the cold atmosphere or the cold weather, felt and sensed by its senses that feels or senses heat rather than sees light, indicating the life and sensation of video and film. So video here is not a technology that simply creates images that stand in as a representation of this landscape. More so, Not Planet Earth and other some related artwork also seen in this show For instance, the work of Ursula Beeman, which I think is a part of the film program, work of Wolfgang Tillmans, his ocean photograph downstairs. Create alternative view of the world connected with a visual regime not relating to the passive image forms of Western natural imaginary of the ocean and the ice of the Svalbard, but kind of as some strange diagram of forces indicating the image technologies as machines don't represent or create standing representations of the world, but can rather produce new set of relations. So the aesthetics of such contemporary artworks and related seems to have to do with the technical and material realities and capacities to sense and partake in the environments and these changing weather conditions. So the question of the relation between technical objects and the living in these environmental or ecological terms is of course not new. It was a subject of discussion in the late 1950s and early 1960s, where a new emphasis on the individual and an agency was challenged by an interest in ontogenesis and the question of self-sufficient systems in which environments were considered as fluid sites through which agency was played out dynamically, so in relation to those others or to others. So this theory was above all introduced by the process philosopher Gilbert Simondon, who questioned what an individual actually is and how it gains autonomy. So introducing his kind of take on the individual or individuation, he argued that the process of individuation does not only take place, or it never takes place within the individual itself, but through its interaction with its environment, which could be internal or external, of course. So any form of being, whether technical, living, or mental, is not sufficient without or before the process of individuation, meaning that technologies in this sense are involved in individuating environments and entities and beings. The process of becoming an individual is always incomplete, and every being involved contributes to the new environmental conditions, according to Simondon. So a few decades before the popularization of the concept of the Anthropocene, Simondon then provides a means of framing our and nature's entanglements with technological processes. He does so without assuming a metaphysical distinction between human beings, forces of nature, and technologies. However, in Not Planet Earth and these other works of Schuppli, we are dealing not with analog, but with digital technologies of video and sound that emerge as kind of strange sensing beings that individuate and produce milieus between air, light, heat, ice units, cold, and electronic signals, and other forms of being in its coming into existence. As Jennifer Gabers remarks in her works on computational sensing technologies within ecological study, I mean, she looks at, for instance, how sensors that measure the flow of tree sap, the moisture in soil and in the air, and detect animal activity, to name but a few. While these machines collect data of environmental processes, they become a part of the environment in which they are situated and operate. So these machines do not only kind of like collect information, they become a part of the environment where they are sensing and existing. So what we are dealing with in the work of Schuppli is the changing weather and environmental pattern beyond the nature-culture divides. Heat waves and freezings, to be more precise, becoming the visual effects or even glitches, which appear to be a part of nature. So what we see in the images of, let's say, this red abstraction before transforming into the purple landscape is weather information emerging, provoking new environmental perspectives in art production. Abstract elements resulting from the device's metastable communication with the cold landscape, a short rush of relations evolving between the cold winds and digital technologies. However, this was not a bond that lasted forever. Because of the cold temperature, the battery life was only 45 minutes. Consequently, Schuppli and her cinematographer only took 2-minute shots. These 2 minutes were lively and highly dynamic, but very challenging for the devices.
Is starting to lag, struggling to build up its image data as liquid crystals appear to freeze. It's almost as if the scene is melting, which of course it actually is.
"6:45 in Not Planet Earth, the LCD screen on the camera even struggled to build up its image data as the liquid crystals in the screen froze and started to lag. A machinic reaction to temperature that created images that blur in accordance with the boat's movement with the ocean. Watching the ocean and ice landscape becomes difficult, an experience we share with a video which appears to exist in a state of almost falling asleep, struggling to keep its eye open. The camera barely establishes images of the water and the landscape as we flow between its wide angle yet very vague vision. So these are imitations of the camera's imagined perception of the ice and the water and their attitude, as if the freezing camera works hard to see and to feel, to establish an environment or a connection with the outer world. So the hypnotic images of the sea and ocean certainly speaks for themselves, presenting perceptions of the natural and technical world as systems both sharing and sensing in ecological terms. So water and ice here emerge as with the technologies and materials of video, making invisible information and energies visible in the production of critical images of the Arctic environment, I would say. So the ambition to realize a collective kind of sensing beyond human representation takes its form in another work that came out of learning from ice. Arctic Archipelago by Susan Schuppli from 2021, which is also included in this ocean exhibition downstairs. So this is a second film made of the footage from the Svalbard journey in 2020. This image provides more images of the actual journey. The crew, the boat, details of the boat, maps, the navigation system, and so forth. And in this work, the human voiceover does not exist in the work. We only hear dark electronic sound, score combined with diegetic and non-diegetic sounds of the motorboat, for instance, big waves, water rushing, winds, birds and other animals seen out there. And during the first sequence, one hears a strange alien kind of sounding beep or crackling as the boat passes a white iceberg vibrating with intense turquoise and pink details. So what we hear there is the sound of cracking isles, whales and other ocean species, and the sound of the ocean water recorded with a geophone and hydrophone that Schuppli had brought to Svalbard. Devices to detect and record ground movements and ocean sounds. So I would say the Arctic archipelago, of course connected to not planet Earth, is in a sense a denaturalization of images and of sensation, as in human perception. The sound of the whales, of moving images and changing ice, life in the ocean beneath, and the rush of water surface as listened to and recorded by these different phones and microphones. So changes in the environment are intuitively identified by these devices, completely remote, in a sense, from human sensing. So Arctic archipelago is therefore almost like a perceptual system. The whole point was to investigate how sensation works beyond the human, while facilitating new connections between Arctic species, ice, and video and sound technologies. So with the grinding, cracking, and strange sounds, you can turn this sound on, please. We should also see here new observations of world-making. So this weather report, which may be one way to interpret this work, depicts real currents of flows of the ocean water, all sensed and made visible with and through the transformative environment, emerging again between thematic materials and natural kind of like beings or existences. And kind of like in Arctic archipelago, it's kind of also these colors that function as a mode of narration to tell the complicated story of agency and matter evolving here. So hence the chromatic spectrum, which is what Susan plays with here, which you also can see plural of times in this film, seems to emanate from the ice induces the material qualities of the life and non-human matter. And one sees these kind of like visual mediations again and again. A whale coming out of the ocean, or water strolling through this little land where they go into land at one stage. It should also be mentioned that there's also darkness in the works of Learning from Ice. In the third sequence of Not Planet Earth, which I'm going to return to now, we see a large white iceberg floating calmly in the sea with dark gray and black horizontal string layered.
Black carbon deposits and sulfate concentrates have all appeared in the Svalbard ice caps.
Jag kan stänga av ljudet där kanske. Tack.
Now microplastics.
So the black is notably not a metaphor for the dark weather, which also could be a way to enter this work. But it's an image of real materials layered in the ice. A berg that has cracked and broken off from the marine terminating glacier. So the black elements rendered by the focus of the camera are, as the voiceover informs us, pollutants, black carbon deposits, and sulfate concentrates. Materials that all appear in the Svalbard ice caps. And as Susan says in the voiceover, now microplastics, especially polyester, fibers from clothing, are flowing into the Arctic and can be found throughout the entire water column, from the seabeds to the surface of the ice and snow, end of quote. So hence the silent black and white ice block consists it is an assemblage of toxic materials layered as strata within the ice column, shored in the geology and the ecosystem, almost like an open and complex system that generates hierarchical bodies, which eventually are territorialized, ordered in assemblages, and joined together in heterogeneous consistency on Earth, absolutely here to stay. The mediation of the black carbon ice core in this work invokes knowledge not only of the natural world and strange nature-technology couplings, but also the experiences and epistemologies of indigenous communities of the Arctic region. As this scene continues. Ta på lite. So these images explicitly communicate that this ice territory is neither neutral or passive, and indigenous epistemologies need to be drawn upon to face the environmental difficulties of the polar region. However, as Metis scholar Zoe Todd observes, not all humans are equally implicated in the forces that created the disasters driving contemporary human environmental crisis. And she argues, not all humans are equally invited into the conceptual spaces where these disasters are theorized or responses to disaster formulated. End of quote. So if we go back a little bit in time then to this final part of this talk, it's interesting to mention that Susan Schuppli's earlier video work, Can the Sun Lie, from 2013 to 2015, exemplifies this political sensitivity further. A video work consisting of archival film footage of courtrooms, news footage, glass photographic glides, iPhone recordings of the sun against the ocean horizon. We see many of these. We're going to close-up of snowflakes, images sampled from the Perlinger archives, and field clips of Canadian Inuits taken from the 16 millimeter films in the collection of the National Film Board of Canada, with Susan Schuppli has spent a lot of time. So the first images, which I'm going to show in a second, show a black and white sunset, followed by archival footage of a US courtroom. Let's watch a couple of minutes of this.
Can the sun lie? Asked a U.S. court in 1886. Perhaps we may say that, though the sun does not lie, the liar may use the sun as a tool. Let us then beware of the liar who lies in the name of the sun. Sun pictures transformed the courtrooms of the late 19th century. For the first time, evidence was entered into legal proceedings that had been produced by a non-human agent, one whose motivations could not be judged, nor whose actions tried for perjury. Could the streaming radiance of the sun manipulate the natural order of things and transform stable realities into spectral images that emerged out of the collusion of chemistry and light? Or did sunlight's persuasive powers of analogy produce such convincing pictures of the real that the subjective processes of human recollection could, it appeared, be overcome? Indeed, proponents of the legal aid provided by sunlight were swift to dismiss any doubts as to its fidelity. We cannot conceive of a more impartial and truthful witness than the sun, as its light stamps and seals the similitude of the wound on the photograph put before the jury. It would be more accurate than the memory of witnesses, and as the object of all is to show truth, why should not this dumb witness show it?
So some pictures came to change the courtroom. In the late 19th century, visual evidence, photographic images, produced by a non-human agent, first entered into legal procedures. So human observation could be ignored, but the photographic memory captured by the created visible truth that no juries could dispute. Cut, and we see images of the EU headquarters, TV studios, visuals from Copenhagen 2015, the UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen 2009, a montage of 4 videos, each showing politicians arriving somewhere important, shaking hands, getting out of the cars, and striking activists being surveilled and arrested by the police. So these images and the edited sequence of rupture from photographic truth to scientific truth, relying on experts and politicians, carefully constructs the questions of who knows the ice and the changing weather patterns. Cut again, and we see historical analog images of soft pastel blue and white Arctic landscapes where Inuits are wandering on glaciers. I'm going to show this final clip.
In Indigenous observations and their oral transmissions are reshaping the epistemic frameworks required for understanding long-term environmental transformations. A reordering of expertise and its claims to truth that turn on the evidence proffered by nature itself.
Climate change here in the Arctic is particularly rapid. The impacts and the effects of climate change challenge and threaten our very right and our ability to exist as an Indigenous people.
Over the years, nobody has ever listened to these people. Every time the discussion is about global warming, about the Arctic warming, it's scientists that go up there and do their work.
It's scientists to go up there and do their job. And policymakers depend on these findings, and nobody ever really understands the people up there. This is a statement from 2010 by the Canadian Inuit film director Zacharias Canuck, is taken from the documentary Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, directed by Canuck and Ian Mauro from 2010, a film I can highly recommend for anyone who hasn't seen it. So the verdict in Can the Sun Lie is clear. We have increasingly relied upon non-human producers of truth, the photographic image, and scientists and other policy makers to analyze the climate change crisis, while completely ignoring the lived bodies of the Arctic, the real observers of the changing weather pattern and the sun. So rather than following the genealogy of an anthropocentric scientific truth with a capital S, and ecologies, Can the Sun Lie reminds us of a non-anthropocentric existence of the sun and the natural world beyond nature, or modern understanding of nature. So truth here lies in the living with the forces and changes of the sun and the weather. For decades, these forces have confused the rhythm of the Inuit life as much as the changing material properties of ice, inciting a realism dealing with what Bruno Latour calls matters of concern, not matters of fact. So this work reminds us that we need to understand truth of land and climate not as scientific facts produced by Eurocentrism, but as a complex assemblage where subjectivity and representation are re-examined in these ecological terms. Geopolitical knowledge of climate change still relies heavily on the language of science and cultural representation. And as Canuck's statement points out, scientists do not even know or even concern themselves with finding out about the environmental changes experienced by the people up there. So the Arctic mediations of different voices and sensing, bodies and matter in Schuppli's work forge, of course, together with a wave of other artists and projects as well, a renewed bond between contemporary art and science of the 21st century. So conclusively, artworks like these rethinks the past and the present, representation and realism, while offering new aesthetic definitions and geopolitics. So the sunsets, melting ice, and moving water in learning from ice unfold the weather and milieux as political device to rethink sensory capacities and the environment today. I think I just end there so we can open up for a discussion. Thank you very much. Shall I just do it? Open up for questions. Any questions or comments, or if someone wants to see some materials, I'm happy to replay it. Also, I mean, so the two main works, the Arctic Archipelago and Not Planet Earth, can obviously be perceived within this Kunsthal, which some of you already may have seen, but Not Planet Earth, Can the Sun Lie? It's not a part of the show. I don't think it's exhibited in Toronto, Montreal either, no. Ingrid.
Thank you, Sara, for unpacking these works. I have a question. It's a very nerdy question, but I will try to ask it. I wonder if you can just expand, or could I hear your take on what, if you see a difference, an ontological difference from the philosophy, the process philosophy of Simondon that you used to kind of unpack the philosophy behind it. This is from the 50s, and I wonder what is the ontological difference of, today's individuations and all these relations. Are there other things going on today that you see? Because there are, 60 years of difference. So what would you say if there would be a kind of ontological difference between that kind of philosophical framework and what we are dealing with today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I kind of slightly tried to touch upon it, at least with that kind of saying, going back to Simondon. Also, I could have introduced some artworks on artists really much, experimenting with this in the 1960s and 1970s. So post these new theories, including like cybernetics, system theory, and so forth and so forth. But there's definitely a shift, or kind of my media archaeological mind would definitely say there's a rupture when the analog becomes digital, because what we're dealing with is becoming computational, right? So we are now dealing with codes and algorithmic processes and so forth, which is absolutely what's at stake in this work as well. And I think that's interesting here, because that, of course, complicates the environmental thought or the ecological thinking here as well, and also the whole kind of worldview and reflection of what an environment is, what's a sensing being, and also in a political sense. I mean, also taking these algorithmic processes and codes and glitches or whatever they are into dialogue with the changing weather patterns in kind of, or in the larger umbrella of what we call or could call the weather. So if we really talk about social, culture and technical differences and changes, I would say that it very much makes a difference. And it definitely also makes a difference of, the production of scientific facts, the circulation of information, knowledge, and so forth. And Jennifer Gabriel writes beautifully about this. She really looks into these strange measurements of sensing technologies and she's also doing lots of field work together, not primarily with artists, but she also goes into the wood, and she's also done a few projects in the Arctic, actually, how complicated those sensor devices actually are, also because they are highly, computational, which complicates the system or the milieu. So it really matters, and it really makes a difference, I would say.
The digital is kind of a key word here that kind of separates in your, not separates, but
yeah, it's a different. It's a different. It's paradigmatic, that shift. It's in if you look at it in a genealogy, in that sense, absolutely. Magnhild.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Thanks for your talk. Very nice. I was also curious about individuation and have been trying to understand that lately. And I was wondering if you can tell me, is there a difference between context and environment and individuation and co-evolution?
What do you mean with context in that sense?
Well, context, just in a kind of general, ordinary, everyday way of understanding the word context. Yeah.
So context would be the environment in a Simonondian sense, in a way. I mean, in order to, as a scholar or an art historian, for instance, to trace, which is, in a sense, what I'm doing, these processes of individuation, which has taken place, right? So that's pretty much where the production of subjectivity and agency take place. So it's not something, it's something that can be traced retrospectively, right? You can predict, but you cannot fully know, but you can trace it retrospectively. And then I think that's when the idea of, context or milieu, whatever how you define or look at it, comes in, because it really depends on, I mean, sure, these theories can be used and we can say that things are connected and will be coming, but it really depends on what you're looking at, right? It really depends on how you enter that network or environment, what you're looking at, what you're tracing, to see what kind of, what relations or processes of individuations evolve. That's at least my way of working with Simondon, if that makes sense. So context is kind of the environment or the situation or consisting of whatever it's in that network or what you're looking at. So it really matters. Yeah.
For your talk. I have maybe a bit of a banal question, but I'm a bit curious because I find it really interesting how Schuppli kind of uses different ways of sensing and different maybe lenses of sensing, and maybe like removing it from a very like hierarchical kind of view or something like that. But I was kind of curious, is it ever possible to kind of escape being a representation? Because as the images we see here today, I mean, can they really escape being representations of nature or of icebergs or whatever? Yeah. Or also, I think maybe also like the sentence where she kind of says that in this landscape there are very many invisible, like geopolitical layers. So for me, I also think it's also a search of representation, but of different kinds of visualizations. So or representations of those layers that are not visual to the naked eye, let's say, and then maybe using different lenses or different machines or technical tools to kind of, to actually represent them.
No, absolutely. I think in terms of representation, I don't think you can escape it, but representation is also an optic, right, which we decide to understand or read or an image or an artwork or whatever it may be. So I'm kind of trying to say that these transformations and the bonding between the technical and material, me being in particularly interested in how she's playing with sensing and production of environments, goes beyond representation in a sense, and there's also kind of a needs new aesthetic definitions and understandings, but an image can still always be a representation. I also definitely think, I mean, she's into visual language as well, absolutely, and I definitely think that's what she's, I mean, calling her work Not Planet Earth is a direct response to representation, that they're classic images of the Anthropocene, so to say. And it's actually a direct reference to a BBC documentary which represents nature in a completely different way, right? But also how to escape that, and I think that's where these glitches and things absolutely come in as well. But I think the language of representations is not sufficient on its own to really understand these works. But of course, there's a narrative there. There's a very, very clear voiceover who explains to you how to read these images all the time and the research behind it. So there's very little room, in a sense, as well, for conceptualism, so to say. And I also think her idea of how to denaturalize the image is a kind of reference to representations and mediations, I would say. So that's also where I'm trying to slightly say, like, to go beyond representation and kind of use mediation in a Simondonian sense to also grasp the different connections and strange entanglements going on in there. So I think the work kind of like flows between both, I would say. Absolutely. It's absolutely in dialogue with language of representation. And in the exhibition, she also refers to on that planet Earth as like a footnote to the Svalbard, or the Arctic archipelago shows. So it's kind of, which is also, you know, text, language, right? In a sense.
One quick question, which is about what you refer to as the digital, because there's it's also like there's a lot of layers in that term, or that rupture that you described. One which is, for example, the availability of media, that everybody can produce images, that it became a kind of that the amount of images that circulate have increased significantly, that the amount of images that we know from the Arctic, for example, has grown so much. There's of course also the fact that images can be manipulated, which is also something that she increasingly, or she is using, and she also explains how images that we are used to encounter from the Arctic, how they often are actually manipulated, cleaned, prepared for us to see something. And then there's also this algorithmic moment that nature becomes computable or informational. And maybe I just wanted to also point to the third video actually in the exhibition, which you might not have seen yet actually, because it came very at the very last moment into the exhibition, which is a conversation with a researcher here in Bergen, Heiko Gölzer, who ran the scenario of ice development, but in a purely algorithmic sense. So he makes images that consist of data that are literally non-representational in a kind of classic sense. They don't depict the landscape, and which is an interesting addition, because that video engages in a conversation where they share maybe a nerdy interest in the kind of constructedness of images and the kind of power dynamics behind how these images are actually made. That was not a question, actually. It was just a kind of
no, it's a great comment. So I think it's a great comment also in terms of, those, being referring to it a few times, but like those images of the Anthropocene. And I think DJ Demos writes so beautiful about this in his Against the Anthropocene book, how those images actually are not of nature, they're highly computational, all these Anthropocene platforms and, there are early works, platforms or for scientific facts or how to get to know our new epoch and so forth was like so loaded with images not real, right? So I think that's really interesting, and I definitely think, I mean, she works a lot with, Susan works a lot with post-production and the digital, but also, you know, she also explores 16:8mm, so she's very much she really much wants to be in dialogue with also with how to sense, how to learn, you know, through these particular devices as well, you know, bringing these different sound recordings and all these different cameras. So and it's nice with it's nice of you to mention the final work as well. I haven't seen it. I'm very much looking forward. But I definitely think that she's in dialogue with that constructionist and how those images can be created and manipulated more, I would say, than circulation of images. So, just really quick.
If there are no further urgent questions, then maybe we close the evening here now, and but we'll be around, and if there are further comments or questions, can we also mention now in a small conversation. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you especially Sara for this amazing talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for great questions and comments, great discussion. Yeah.